Welcome, folks. We're back to U.S. history. We're talking about lesson 2 of semester 2. The title of this lesson is Becoming a World Power. And really in this lesson we're going to look at the United States as it takes its place among the other nations, especially the nations of Europe, as the most powerful countries on earth. And if you recall, up to this point we've really talked about the United States as its own entity internally. We've talked about how it became a nation. We've talked a little bit about its problems that it dealt with in the early years of a nation, generally revolving around things like slavery, how that led to a civil war, and ultimately where we had to reconstruct ourselves as a nation. After that point, the U.S. Gains in strength and really can become a player on the world stage, and that's really what this is all about. So the time frame we're talking about here is the last 25 years of the 1800s and the first little bit of the 1900s up until World War I. And so we'll see how the U.S. gained a reputation and gained power around the world as an important nation in the world stage. The word imperialism you may have heard when you were talking in U.S. or world history about things like Rome and some of the early empires of Britain and things of that sort. The idea of imperialism is going outside your borders, taking over other countries, and expanding your reach. And America, even though it was kind of a late player on the scene, becomes an imperialist nation. And it does that because of trade. It really wants to expand its markets, wants to broaden the places that it can control in order to sell stuff. And so really trade is driving this American imperialism. And because Europe kind of controls Europe and the African part of the world, the United States looks to where it can control, and it really looks to the Caribbean and to Asia as its next places to go. In 1854, this is actually even before the Civil War, Admiral, Commodore Perry, his name is, takes a ship and sails to Japan. Japan at that point is a very insular, inward-looking nation, and this is an opportunity for the United States to develop some trade routes with Japan. A little bit later, in 1887, Hawaii, which is of course our 50th state, is annexed or taken over from the United States. And the philosophy at this point is something called speak softly and carry a big stick. This is Teddy Roosevelt comes up with this phrase. He was our president at about the turn of the 1900s to the 1800s to the 1900s. And the idea is that you don't have to make a lot of noise if you're a powerful nation. So if you have the weaponry, you can pretty much get your way. And the big way we do this is by modernizing our Navy. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the power is not the Air Force like we might think of it now, but it's really the Navy. It's powerful, fast ships. The people that have the biggest Navy control their area. And certainly we saw that with the Spanish Navy in the 1500s. We saw that with the British Navy after that point, and the United States wants to increase its Navy. And it does that because really since the Civil War up until about the turn of the century, its Navy had not been modified very much. And so there's a real need to modernize ships as the American influence increases and as we want to try to compete with the European nations. And so we build a brand new fleet of battleships, and they're coal-driven, which is the fastest, most powerful way to build a ship at that point. They have electricity. They're armed with torpedoes, and their entire outer skin is coated with armor. So these are fierce warships to be reckoned with on the world stage. One of the main early battles that kind of deals with this American imperialism was the Spanish-American War. And it really began in Cuba with the Cuban Rebellion. The people of Cuba tried to throw off their colonial bounds, and the United States sees this as an opportunity to kind of take over a neighbor, a place that has some very good trade and very good export markets. And so there are battles in Cuba, and then because Cuba is controlled by Spain, also in the Philippines, which is also controlled by Spain. So the United States takes on Spain in those two locations around the world. And in that war, we had very, very few battle deaths. Only 385 Americans die in battle in Cuba and the Philippines, but over 2,000 die of disease. So this really talks about, in the 1800s and 1900s, the wars had as much to do with disease and things of that sort as it did with actual wounds that one would expect in a battle. However, the United States becomes a world power, a colonial power during this time. It takes over Cuba and it takes over the Philippines during this battle. It wins the Spanish-American War. And it really introduces a young Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, to the American public. This is before he becomes the vice president, before he becomes the president of the United States. He is seen as a war hero in the Spanish-American War. And also at this time, we see another president assassinated. Of course, we've had President Lincoln assassinated. He's our first American president assassinated, killed while in office. We have President Garfield a few years later, and now we have President McKinley. McKinley was elected for a second term in 1900, and when he was at a speech in Buffalo in September of 1901, he's shot by an anarchist, somebody who doesn't believe in government, shoots President McKinley, who ultimately dies several days later, leaving this young, powerful 42-year-old Vice President Theodore Roosevelt to become president. And he becomes, at that point, the youngest president in the history of the United States. And this is a whole era, a time frame where there's a lot of anarchy, a lot of questioning of governments, and lots of world leaders, not only in the United States, but also in Europe especially, are assassinated. So the assassination of President McKinley, while a tragedy to the United States, is something that we're seeing around the world. Well, we talked a little bit about the United States' desires to open its trade with Asia. And of course, the biggest market today, and it was back then as well, in Asia is China. And so China is a critical point where lots of European nations wish to enter. You know, there's millions and millions of people in China. It's a very fertile country. There's a huge opportunity to export and import from China. So lots of different European nations are trying to see who's going to control those exports. So China, because it has a very weak internal government at this point, allows itself to be kind of carved up by several European nations, including the United States, in the late 1800s. There's also an attempt by these nations, as we've seen in colonialization over the course of our country, to bring Christianity to this nation as well. And so the Chinese get to know lots of missionaries coming from different places to try to Christianize the country. However, this is not necessarily enjoyed by all the people in China. China is a very proud nation, and many people don't believe that the Europeans should be coming and exerting their influence in their country. And one society that is dedicated to try to getting the foreigners out of China are called the Boxers. And the Boxers rebel against the colonial oppressors, as they see it, and kill over 200 foreigners. And that is a good opportunity for international troops to be sent from the United States and other nations to try to beat down that rebellion. And so we see that happening at this time frame as well. Another huge thing that's happening that shows kind of American might across the world outside of our borders is the construction of the Panama Canal. One of the problems with geography in the Western Hemisphere is that you have this huge landmass going all the way from the Arctic almost down to the Antarctic. This North America, then Central America, all the way down to South America. And there's no break. If a ship wants to go from New York to San Francisco, it has to go all the way around South America. And so the United States sees an opportunity to cut that route by building a canal through this very, very small and thin country of Panama, which is right north of where North America connects with South America. So Panama is a country at that point. It's its own country, and America annexes or takes over a chunk of this part of the world to construct the canal in 1903. So we just decide we want it, we take it over. It becomes one of the largest civil works projects ever undertaken. It's bigger than the Hoover Dam. It's bigger than the construction of any of the major water projects in the United States. It's just gigantic. But what it ultimately does is it shortens the distance between the Atlantic and the Pacific by more than 8,000 miles. So a ship now that wants to go from New York to San Francisco can go through the Panama Canal and save itself 8,000 miles. And as you can imagine, with that one change, that one construction project, the trade routes in the world are significantly altered. So now America has a much bigger reach than it ever did before.